Marco Polo is considered the man who first gave Europe a picture of China. Many believed him, many doubted him. Was he really there, or did he just recount what others had experienced? The evidence is scarce, the manuscripts are contradictory, but some details are so precise that only an eyewitness could have known them. This is the story behind the most famous traveler of the Middle Ages, and the facts you've never heard before. Translated with deepl.com free version.
Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something heavy, but also something incredibly necessary and deeply human. We're wrestling with one of the most persistent and, frankly, painful questions of modern history. Why? Why did millions of ordinary people follow Adolf Hitler and support the Nazi regime?
It's a question that has really haunted generations. And our goal here, what the source material is really trying to get at, is a psychological one. It's that question. Hätten wir mitgemacht?
Would we have participated?
Exactly. And to understand that, you have to look past the fanatics and the masterminds and focus on the vast majority of people who were neither. They weren't heroes, but they weren't monsters either.
Right. And that's our focus for this deep dive. We're looking at sources, historical research, sociological studies, a lot of psychological analysis, all trying to unpack the mass psychology behind this period.
We're talking about the incredible power of conformity, the mechanics of state propaganda.
And also the systemic incentives, the things the regime created to encourage people to just go along.
And that leads us straight to the central concept that really emerged after it all fell apart. It's a term that tries to categorize the involvement of the average person, the Mitläufer.
Okay, let's unpack that term properly, because when we hear Mitläufer today, it's just so heavy with negative judgment, a failure of moral courage.
It is now, yes.
Sure.
But you have to understand, right after 1945, during the denazification process run by the Allies, the term itself, which translates to something like fellow traveler or one who went along, it became a specific legal and bureaucratic category.
So it wasn't just a moral judgment, it was a filing status, almost.
That's the critical distinction. The Allies set up 5 categories of involvement. At the very top, you had Category 1, the major offenders, then the offenders, Category 2.
And at the bottom?
At the bottom, Category 5, you had the exonerated, the people cleared of any real involvement, and the Mitläufer, Category 4, sat right above them.
So just one step above being completely exonerated, what did that mean for them in practice? What did that legal status actually do?
It meant they were judged to have passively supported the regime. Maybe they were a party member, maybe they went to a few rallies, but they didn't commit crimes or hold any real power.
Their involvement was seen as more compliant or opportunistic, maybe.
Exactly. More that than fanatical. And the penalties reflected that. We're talking about minor fines, maybe some short-term limits on what kind of job you could have. It wasn't severe for most.
And the sheer number of people who fell into that category, millions, it just shows you how wide that net was cast.
It does. And what's really fascinating, and the sources really bring this out, is the psychological shift this category represents. I mean, before 1945, the act of going along, of wanting to belong to a group, that was often seen as a pretty natural social impulse.
A desire for community, for order.
Right. That overwhelmingly negative moral weight we feel today that really only solidified after the war, when the nation had to start reckoning with this idea of collective guilt.
So, to answer that question, would we have participated? We need to get inside that psychology. We need to understand just how powerful the influence of a majority, especially a totalitarian state, can be on an individual. The Mitläufer is the everyman caught in the gears of the system.
It is.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for the deep dive. We're going to start with the really visible stuff, the almost theatrical mechanisms the regime used to capture people's hearts and minds.
The spectacle. The cult of personality and the powerful, overwhelming lure of the crowd.
Then we'll move into the systemic pressures, the incentives, how the regime made it profitable, or at least safe, to belong. We'll talk about Gleichschaltung and the creation of the so-called Volksgemeinschaft.
And finally, we'll explore the other side, the psychology of resistance. What did it actually take for that tiny, tiny fraction of people to stand up and say no against that overwhelming tide?
It's a journey from spectacle to system, and then right back to the individual choices people had to make.
Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's start with the staging of it all. The Inszenierung. The sources are really clear on this. By about 1935, Adolf Hitler wasn't just a party leader anymore. He was meticulously staged as something More.
Something beyond politics. The sources use these really strong words for it: a redeemer, an Erlöser, or a savior, a Heilsbringer.
And the staging was everything. The sheer scale of it was designed to be completely overwhelming.
We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people gathering for these mass events like the Nuremberg Party rallies, the Reichspartide, or the May Day celebrations. These were not just political meetings.
No, they were expertly choreographed, immersive theatrical productions. So what made them so different from, say, a political rally in Britain or the US at the time? Was it just the number of people?
It was more than that. It was the deliberate fusion of architecture, of light, of sound, of messaging. Think of Albert Speer's Cathedral of Light at Nuremberg.
Like the searchlights.
Exactly. Huge banks of anti-aircraft searchlights, all pointed straight up into the sky. It created these ethereal, vertical walls of light. It made you feel like you were inside a sacred space, not a stadium. This was designed to evoke a kind of religious awe.
And the films and images from that era. Leni Riefenstahl, for example. We have to remember this wasn't just accidental documentary footage.
Not at all. It was pure, conscious propaganda, mounted, edited, and staged to create one single, unified narrative.
And that narrative's entire purpose was what the sources call Identitätsstiftung, the foundation of a new, unified German identity.
Precisely. Everything, the flags, the marching, the speeches, the lights, was designed to inspire unity, enthusiasm, and most importantly, unconditional loyalty.
To the regime, the people, and to Hitler himself. All summarized in that one totalizing slogan.
Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer.
One people, one Reich, one leader. It wasn't just a political call to action. It was an emotional decree. It demanded your complete identification with the collective. And here's the consequence of that meticulous image control, which is so profound. Because they were so effective at engineering their public perception, those official propaganda images still dominate how we visualize that era.
That's so true. We lack mass-produced visual alternatives. We don't have 1,000 home movies showing people looking bored or skeptical at a rally. The official image is almost all we have.
The visual medium was a weapon. But let's pivot to the psychology of being in that crowd, because the desire to be swept up is universal, and the Nazis were masters at exploiting that.
They were, and let's use that Oktoberfest analogy because it's so helpful.
Yeah, it really is.
Think about it. You'll see normally reserved, quiet people. They'll get up on the benches. They'll sing these loud, often very cheesy Schlager songs at the top of their lungs.
Because they would never, ever do by themselves in public.
Never. They're participating in a kind of collective euphoria that's only possible because everyone else is doing it. It shows you how contagious that collective emotion is and the powerful immediate pull of the group.
And you have to remember the context. In the early 1930s, Germany was reeling. Post-WWI, humiliation, economic collapse, political chaos. There was no internet, no social media, none of the mass entertainment we have.
So these state-sponsored, highly produced events, they filled this massive sociological and psychological void. They tapped into a deep, desperate need for a strong, unified community identity, a Gemeinschaft.
So the rallies weren't just offering political direction, they were offering a sense of belonging, strength, purpose. Things that have been missing for a very long time.
Yeah.
The crowd becomes a kind of psychological shelter.
Exactly. But the Führer cult didn't just stop when the rally ended. It had to permeate everyday life.
So how did they make his image so omnipresent, even when you weren't in a massive stadium?
Well, after he became chancellor, his physical and symbolic presence was just constant. His portrait was mandatory in every office, every school, most homes. You saw him in the cinema newsreels, which were essential viewing.
On the streets with flags and banners, and of course the mandatory salute.
The salute, the Heil Hitler greeting, it affected every age group, conditioning them from childhood to this idea of a single, unquestionable leader.
And some of the subtle signs of the cult's influence are fascinating. We talked about the popularity of the name Adolf.
Yes, the name saw a huge spike in popularity in 1933 and 1934. It's a small thing, but it shows his status as, at the very least, a national trendsetter.
And the mustache. The Hitlerbart?
The two-finger mustache. It existed before him, of course, but his complete saturation of the visual landscape meant he monopolized it. It became an ideological symbol just through his association.
And the consequences for even slightly disrespecting that image. They reveal the extent of the regime's control over private life. The sources point out that just insulting Hitler could be considered grounds for divorce.
Think about what that means. The state is intervening directly into the most intimate bond, the family. It's not just treason against the state anymore. It's treated as a fundamental moral failing against the collective and against the leader himself.
It shows how deep that enforced reverence ran. It controlled the public square, the workplace, and right down to the home. The cult demanded your total internalization.
It did.
And that idea of total internalization leads us right into the next section. The systematic indoctrination of young people. This was seen as absolutely critical for making the regime last.
For the National Socialists, academic education, learning math or literature in the traditional sense, that was completely secondary. It was often just subordinate to ideological shaping.
The goal wasn't to create critical thinkers.
Quite the opposite. The goal was to raise future soldiers and future mothers who were dutiful, compliant, obedient, people who would happily accept their systemic disempowerment. The word they used was Entmündigung, which literally means placing someone under guardianship.
Like a child, they were being trained for subservience.
For Unterwürfigkeit, yes. And the integration was ruthless, and it started early. Children were funneled into organizations like the Hitler Youth, the HJ, or the League of German Girls, the BDM. And this wasn't about teaching history. It was about shaping behavior and belief.
Hitler himself was chillingly clear about this. There's that quote from the sources. It lays out the whole goal of internalized servitude.
This youth will learn nothing else but to think German, act German, and they will never be free their whole lives, and they will be happy about it.
And they will be happy about it. That's the part that's so terrifying. The goal wasn't just forced compliance. It was making the surrender of your own freedom feel like a source of personal happiness.
It's the ultimate goal of totalitarianism. And to achieve that, the NSDAP had to have this comprehensive reach. They sought to influence every single corner of German life. Family, leisure, work, public spaces, even institutions like the churches.
How did they manage that level of ubiquity?
Through a web of local groups, the Ortsgruppen, block wardens, and countless sub-organizations that permeated daily routine. If you were a worker, you were in the German Labor Front. If you were a woman, there was a specific women's organization for you. They systematically removed the possibility of a private life, a life outside the party's gaze.
And this brings us right to the fundamental psychological concept at the heart of the Mitläufer phenomenon, conformity. We join a group for security, for belonging. But the trade-off, the price you pay, is surrendering some of your individual freedom. The norms of the group become your personal guidelines.
And if you fail to meet those conditions, you face immense pressure, peer pressure, what the Germans call Gruppenzwang. And this psychological pressure to align with the majority is absolutely critical to understanding why so many people chose to go along, even when their private conscience might have been screaming at them.
This is where the analysis in the sources gets really deep, because they use this powerful modern experiment to illustrate just how hard it is to engage in even low-stakes nonconformity.
Right, the public singing experiment. The scenario was simple. Researchers would go into a busy pedestrian zone in Frankfurt, and they'd ask an individual to stand on a small box and just sing out loud.
Something totally harmless, but also profoundly against unwritten social rules.
And when they approached people individually, the results were almost universal hesitation, or just flat-out refusal. One subject said the discomfort came from the attention, the strange looks, worrying what people would think. Is she crazy? What is she doing?
So the fear wasn't physical, it was social shame.
Purely social. It's the sheer force of these unwritten, fixed social norms. Loud singing in a shopping district is just categorized as inappropriate. It requires this enormous psychological effort to defy that unspoken rule, even when there are zero actual consequences.
And this ties directly back to our evolutionary wiring, doesn't it? We are, at our core, herd animals.
Absolutely. The desire to belong is hardwired in our brains because for most of human history, being expelled from the group meant death. We use social proof. We look at what everyone else is doing to figure out what is safe and correct.
So when you act differently, your brain literally registers danger. It triggers anxiety.
Cognitive dissonance, exactly. You have to justify to yourself why your behavior is right when the actions of everyone around you suggest it's wrong.
So when they repeated that experiment in Frankfurt, but this time with a small group, the result completely flipped.
It flipped entirely. When they got 6 people together to sing Happy Birthday, it became significantly easier. The group environment provided a kind of psychological armor.
That's the power of having an ally, isn't it?
It is. Being surrounded by others doing the same thing made the behavior suddenly feel normal, at least within that small context. The subjects felt reassured because they weren't isolated individuals facing judgment anymore. They were part of a unified, temporary front.
You're no longer an outsider, you're part of a we, and you can look to your allies for reassurance. See? We're normal here.
That internal shift just drastically reduces the anxiety of nonconformity.
So let's connect this back. If it takes that much psychological effort to sing happy birthday in a street where nothing bad can happen to you, no police, no fine, just some strange looks, how astronomically harder is it to not conform when that behavior is sanctioned by losing your reputation, losing your job, by police intervention, prison, persecution, or even death?
The difference is exponential. In the Nazi system, the threat was total. The Gruppenzwang was enforced by the state with violence. The sources confirm that very few Germans were true resistance fighters, precisely because overcoming that hardwired impulse to belong when the state has weaponized social exclusion and terror. It's a heroic, deeply unnatural act for a human being.
We are fundamentally influenced by the people around us. That is a permanent human condition, and the Mitlofer phenomena is just the catastrophic result of that condition going unquestioned in a totalitarian state.
While the cult and the crowd were vital for that initial enthusiasm, the regime's long-term survival depended on systemic control. And, crucially, on providing very clear incentives for complicity.
Right. After Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, the consolidation of power, the diktat of the state, was incredibly swift, and it was legalistic, which made it harder for people to see it as a coup.
All other political parties, all the trade unions, they were banned almost immediately. By July of 1933, just 6 months in, Germany was officially a one-party state, governed only by the NSDAP.
And this was the process of Gleichschaltung, synchronization or coordination.
The goal was total bureaucratic alignment. It wasn't just about forcing people to agree with Nazi ideology. It was about dismantling and replacing every independent structure in society.
So what did that look like on the ground? Was it just overnight chaos?
No, it was meticulous. It was bureaucratic. Take the media. Independent newspapers were either shut down or forced to adhere to strict editorial guidelines from the propaganda ministry.
And professional associations, doctors, lawyers.
All dissolved and then reformed under new Nazi-controlled leadership. Local and state governments lost all their autonomy. Every sphere of life, right down to sports clubs and singing societies, was purged and synchronized. Anything considered un-German or non-Aryan was slated for destruction.
And this violent purification process is where the Mitläufer crosses that line from just being a passive follower to becoming an active opportunist. The sources are really clear that these purges created massive career opportunities overnight.
Absolutely. This was the dark engine of economic incentive. The mass dismissals, especially of Jewish individuals, but also outspoken regime critics, communists, social democrats, suddenly left tens of thousands of good jobs open.
In universities, law firms, hospitals, government.
All of it. This created a horrifying bargain for the average German, for very real, measurable personal gain, a better salary, a safer job, a promotion you'd been waiting for. Many Germans simply accepted the discrimination, the persecution, and eventually the deportation of their neighbors and colleagues.
Their silence, or even their active participation, was often bought with a new office or a better apartment.
The regime provided a clear ladder to success. But you had to be willing to step over other people, often people who had been your friends or mentors, to climb it.
And to legitimize all of this systemic theft and exclusion, the Nazis had to define their new social structure, the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community.
This was the exclusive club, and membership was limited to the racially pure, healthy German, according to their pseudoscientific definitions. This community was intentionally built on radical exclusion.
The power of the concept was that it was defined primarily by who was left outside. It created this hard binary of us versus them.
Precisely. And those outside were stripped of their belonging and given new labels. They were Volksschädling pests of the people, or foreign peoples, Fremdvölker.
That term, Volksschädling, it's so important. It's a legalistic term that transforms a political opponent into a biological threat. A pest to be eradicated, not a neighbor to disagree with.
And that fundamentally changed the psychological license the majority had to act against them. And within the community, within the Volksgemeinschaft, the regime demanded unity, solidarity, and the absolute prioritization of the collective over the individual.
That slogan, Gemeinnütz geht vor Eigennutz.
Community benefit before individual benefit. And that wasn't just propaganda, it was an instruction. It was an instruction to report anyone you saw prioritizing themselves or, crucially, anyone showing compassion for those who had been cast outside the community.
Let's just trace the speed of this moral decay, because the timeline the sources provide is horrifying. The speed at which passive acceptance became active participation.
It was shockingly fast.
Yeah.
Okay, April 1st, 1933. The National Socialists order a boycott of Jewish businesses. Now, while many people participated, the sources indicate that a lot of Germans were still hesitant. They mostly just looked away.
But there were still isolated acts of solidarity, people still going to a Jewish shop.
Yes, that was passive acceptance for the most part. Now, fast forward just 5 years. The November pogroms of 1938, Kristallnacht. Jewish people are now being violently abused, abducted, murdered in the streets.
And now, a significantly larger number of Germans became active perpetrators, looting, participating in the violence.
The key here is the normalization of exclusion. By 1938, protest against this violence was virtually non-existent because the logic of the Volksgemeinschaft had fully taken hold.
Once you were outside that circle, once you were labeled a pest, you lost your right to protection. You were no longer seen as a person on eye level.
Exactly. And that psychological shift is what allowed for the normalization of increasingly absurd legal restrictions. The sources mention the systematic rules forbidding Jews from using streetcars, or sitting on certain park benches, or towns proudly advertising themselves as Judenfrei free of Jews.
And these actions were no longer seen as criminal or even immoral by most of the Mitläufer class. They seemed logically consistent.
Because the excluded group was no longer perceived as belonging to the human community that deserved protection, the psychological distance created by those labels facilitated the collapse of fundamental human decency. The speed of that collapse is it's one of the darkest takeaways of the whole era.
It is.
Of course, all these mechanisms of control and conformity, they only worked because the preconditions for Hitler's rise were already there. Germany was a deeply traumatized nation.
The defeat and humiliation of World War I, followed by the political and economic instability of Weimar Republic.
Right. And the NSDAP started as this tiny, insignificant splinter party in 1920. But Hitler quickly mastered the techniques of mass politics. And after the failed Munich Putsch in 1923, he had a realization.
He recognized he couldn't overthrow the state with force.
Not yet. He committed to destroying democracy from within the system through so-called legal means.
And by the late 1920s, the NSDAP had become a genuine mass party. And crucially, they marketed themselves as the complete opposite of the established political competition, which they just dismissed as weak, compromised, and old.
They promised a clean sweep to get rid of all the old politicians, the old problems, the old parties. They offered this radical promise of a new Germany.
And that promise was hugely amplified by the global economic crisis of 1929. People were desperate, unemployed, terrified for their future.
And Hitler skillfully exploited that fear and chaos. He was positioned as the solution precisely because he had never been in power before. He was seen as unspent or unworn, untainted by the failures of the Weimar system.
So for many people, even in the educated professional classes, he wasn't necessarily a messiah, but he was definitely seen as the lesser evil, the only one strong enough to restore order.
The only one who could make Germany strong again.
And the actual political maneuvering that ended German democracy is just so short and brutal. The pace of the power grab after he was appointed chancellor on January 30th, 1933 is breathtaking.
That first 4-week period was absolutely critical. The opposition was fractured. The conservative elites who put him in power thought they could control him. They severely miscalculated.
And then the Reichstag fire happened.
Within 4 weeks of him taking office. And following that very suspicious fire, the president was convinced to issue the Reichstag fire decree, which basically suspended all basic civil liberties. That gave the regime the legal cover to begin mass arrests of communists and other political opponents.
And then another 4 weeks later, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act.
An act that was pushed through by coercion, by banning opponents from even voting. And it formally allowed Hitler's government to enact laws all on its own. It essentially ended constitutional government. Gleichschaltung had officially begun. Democracy was legally destroyed.
And the rush to join the winning side was immediate.
Instantaneous. The NSDAP saw such a massive, opportunistic flood of new members, the classic Mitläufer looking for security and personal advantage, that they eventually had to impose a membership freeze.
Wait, why would they freeze membership if their success depended on mass support?
It was driven by an internal fear within the regime. They were afraid of their own success. They were worried about being flooded by too many cynical opportunists who only cared about personal gain, not ideological purity.
So they couldn't even tell the difference between a true believer and a classic Mitläufer.
Exactly. The line had become structurally impossible for them to discern.
But the myth of Hitler's infallibility, that image of him as the political savior, it was reinforced by things people could see, tangible successes, even if they were built on very shaky foundations.
The economic policies of rearmament, building up the army, massive public works programs, they did create jobs. They did temporarily reduce unemployment.
Even if it was funded by reckless state debt that was basically going to be paid for by conquering other countries.
Right. And even today, people will point to the construction of the Autobahn network as a positive achievement of that era.
Then came the foreign policy successes. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, and the early Blitz victories at the start of World War II.
By 1940, Hitler was at the absolute zenith of his power. This perception of unrelenting political and military success, it validated all the risks and the moral compromises that millions of Germans had made to follow him.
The sources describe him as being perceived by many Germans as almost supernatural by that point. No longer just a normal person, it cemented the cult.
Success justifies everything, especially moral decay in the minds of the followers.
It's just so clear that the cult and the systemic incentives were deeply, deeply ingrained. I mean, we still feel the consequences in our language today. We still talk about Hitler Germany, the Führer cult, the Hitler Bart.
And of course, the lasting cultural taboo around the name Adolf. While other common Nazi-era names, Joseph, Heinrich, Leni, Magda, are all accepted, Adolf remains basically unusable. It's the lasting shadow of that personality cult.
So we circle all the way back to the central finding. The overwhelming majority of Germans complied. They were Mitläufer.
They complied for a whole spectrum of reasons. Genuine conviction for some, blind obedience for others, profound opportunism, sheer convenience, and of course, overwhelming fear.
The critical point is that the Nazis didn't need every German to be a fanatic.
Not at all. They just needed the majority not to resist. That's all it took for the system to function perfectly.
And that brings us to the individuals who chose otherwise. That tiny fraction who resisted the Gruppenzwang, and that famous image of the man in the crowd who refused to give the Hitler salute. He really represents that choice.
He does, and the sources highlight this profound ambiguity in identifying who he actually was, which itself tells a story. We have two strong possibilities, and each one represents a different source of resistance.
Okay, so possibility A is August Landmesser.
His refusal, if it was him, was driven by a profound personal loyalty and love. He was in love with a Jewish woman, wanted to marry her, which the regime considered a racial disgrace. His resistance stemmed from valuing his personal human bond over the state's ideology.
And tragically, neither he nor she survived the regime.
They did not. Now, possibility B is a man named Gustav Wegert. His refusal came from a completely different place. It was based on deep, unwavering faith.
He was a devout Christian.
A devout Christian who rejected the NS regime's paganism and refused the salute on religious principle. He believed his ultimate loyalty belonged to God, not to the Führer, and he survived the war.
And the fact that we don't know for sure who it was, that emphasizes a really profound truth, doesn't it? Resistance didn't come from one single unified political ideology.
Not at all. People resisted for diverse fundamental reasons: love, faith, moral conscience, political conviction. It teaches us that resistance isn't monolithic. It emerges from many small, deeply personal decisions that accumulate over time.
It's that repeated decision to prioritize facts, reason, compassion, and your own personal courage over that powerful evolutionary impulse just to belong.
But the question is, how can an average person reinforce that choice against the instinct of the herd? The psychological research does offer some insights there.
Okay, let's get into that. If the Mitläufer choice is rooted in that deep fear of social isolation, what specific strategies can you or I use to consciously reinforce reason over compliance?
Well, one key strategy is something psychologists call pre-mortem thinking. You actively anticipate the group's pressure before the critical moment arrives.
So you rehearse it in your mind.
You do. If you mentally rehearsed what you would do if, say, you were asked to participate in a boycott, you create a kind of cognitive anchor that's much harder to dislodge when the emotional pull of the crowd starts to take over.
So it's about establishing a personal core value set, a red line that you commit to beforehand.
Precisely. Another technique is to actively seek out dissenting opinions, even when especially when they make you uncomfortable. The Nazi system depended on eliminating all dissent, on Gleichschaltung.
So on an individual level, we can fight that by intentionally exposing ourselves to different views.
Yes. You can reinforce your own reliance on facts by reading things you disagree with, by having conversations with people who see the world differently. It prevents that psychological synchronization that makes the group's narrative feel so infallible.
And that brings us back to the ultimate psychological takeaway from the researchers, the one from the singing experiment. We can more easily withstand group pressure when we have allies.
The presence of just one other person who chooses not to conform makes the cost of stepping out of line exponentially lower. That single ally transforms what would be a solitary, dangerous stand into a shared, safer choice.
The lesson of the Mitläufer isn't just about the failures of history. It's really a living blueprint for how to protect our individual integrity today.
It is.
So this deep dive into the psychology of the Mitläufer, it's been intense, but it's shown us, I think, three critical things. First, the staggering power of orchestrated spectacle and cult creation.
Second, the incredible speed at which moral standards can just collapse when you introduce systemic incentives like opportunism and exclusion.
And third, the immense evolutionary difficulty of nonconformity, even in the most trivial, harmless circumstances.
And the phenomena we've dissected here, the lure of the crowd, the pressure to conform, the tendency to accept personal gain at the expense of others, these are fundamental psychological forces. They are not relics confined to the 1930s.
No, they are still actively at work in our society, in our politics, in our workplaces right now, today. The history of the Mitläufer is a profound challenge to our present selves. We've established that the impulse to belong is overwhelmingly powerful and that it takes active steps to overcome it.
Which leads to our final question, and it isn't a historical one. It's immediate.
Given how difficult it is to avoid being a fellow traveler, what specific, measurable step, a pre-mortem commitment, an intentional search for a dissenting voice, what can you put into practice this week to reinforce your own reliance on reason and facts?
And what is the smallest act of allyship? That tiny decision to stand with someone, not against them, even when the current of the group flows in the opposite direction, that you can commit to today.
That choice, as always, remains yours.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Farewell.